welcome to all of you joining us here this morning for breakfast at the Media City Bergen complex, and also to those of you following us on the stream. We'll be discussing something big and important this morning, so I hope you're all bright and awake. We'll be discussing whether or not we have forgotten who we actually produce journalism for, and what we might actually do about it. My name is Ingeborg Volan. I am the editor for publishing strategy at the Norwegian Business Daily, and I also serve on the advisory board for the media cluster here in Bergen. And I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, someone who I think might tease you, provoke you, but also give you some hope and inspiration on thinking differently about how we approach journalism and who it's for. Our first speaker is an award-winning journalist who's also affiliated with the cluster in Wales, who's a collaborator with the cluster here in Bergen, and who I've come to know as a very thoughtful and inspirational thinker about the new ways we might approach journalism. So he'll introduce himself in a little bit. Please welcome to the stage Shirish Kulkarni.
Thank you so much, Ingeborg, and it's definitely a pleasure to be here, particularly after this difficult time for the world. And really, I think, as Ingeborg said, to talk about really big, important stuff, because I truly believe that as journalists, we can change the world for the better. And it sounds like a really big, kind of shocking statement, because sometimes people are shocked when I say that. But I want to take us back, particularly journalists here, to why we became journalists. And I'd say probably for more than 90% of us, it was exactly that, because we wanted to make the world a better place. And so I think the reason sometimes people find that shocking, or the kind of that we want to make the world a better place, is because the practice of journalism has become quite detached from the purpose of journalism. And really my work is about bringing those two things back together. So I'm going to start by, as we say, journalism being for citizens, not for journalists. That's the thing I want us to focus on, because too often we make journalism for ourselves, for each other, and forget about really what we're... Always a treat. We forget about what we're really here for. And people at these conferences and things often say to me, how do we save the journalism industry? And I want to be clear, I don't want to save the journalism industry as it's currently constituted. If you'll excuse my language, too often it's a shitty industry with shitty people with shitty attitudes. And actually, we need to rethink, which we're here in Future Week, we need to rethink what a journalism that's truly fit for the future can look like. And it's not the same as the journalism we've had so far. So just a little bit about me. So I'm you can kind of, don't be fooled by the boyish good looks. I've been doing this for 25 years now. So I've been a journalist. I think pretty uniquely, I've worked at every major broadcaster in the UK. And definitely uniquely, I've done every job in a newsroom. So I've directed and vision mixed bulletins. I've edited bulletins. I've been a cameraman editor on the road in Foreign Bureau as well. So I've done pretty much everything you can do in a newsroom. The last couple of years, with the cluster programme in South Wales, I've been researching new forms of storytelling, which is largely what I'm going to be talking about today. And then also alongside that, I work a couple of days a week at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in their Bureau local team, which is specifically designed to work with communities from the ground up, to build news with and for communities. So I'm employed there as a community organiser, not as a journalist. And what I'd say is I hope that has taught me a little bit about how the industry works. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start by talking about how and why journalism is broken and how we're doing it all wrong right now. We're going to think a little bit about what stories are and why we need them at a fundamental, visceral, evolutionary level. We're going to talk about what I think the future can look like. Citizen-focused journalism made by, with, and for citizens. And then I'm going to talk about how we can engage with the future. So looking ahead, what does journalism that's truly fit for the future look like? And for me, that is based in community, care, which I'll explain a bit more about, and AI. So, starting with how journalism is broken. We're facing right now three big, well, a lot of existential problems, but I'm going to focus on three right now. So trust is the main one. So just as in the UK, this is from the Reuters Digital News Report, 36% of people say they can trust news most of the time. And only 44% trust even the news they use. Now, sometimes we skip over numbers like that. But if less than half of our readers and viewers trust even the news they use, we are failing, right? Because that, if they're not trusting what they're watching or reading, we're not doing our jobs. The second is engaging young people. Now, we need to engage young people, not just because they're young. I don't think we need to do news especially differently for young people just because they're young. But actually, they are the audience of the future. So clearly, we need to engage them. And finally, inclusion. So innovation isn't just about telling stories differently. People get hung up on, let's create this new format. But actually, it's about telling different stories. Now, the thought experiment I use for this is we always hide behind this idea of journalistic objectivity, right? But think about if everyone in your newsroom was a woman, or think about if everyone in your newsroom was a person of color, or think about if everyone in your newsroom was disabled. Would you get the same stories from all of those newsrooms? Now, clearly you wouldn't. But then that blows apart any notion. No. Okay, I'm happy. So yeah, so going back, if we accept that we'd get different stories from those newsrooms, any notion of journalistic objectivity is blown apart. Our newsrooms are systemically racist, sexist, homophobic, ableist. We could go on, but we need to address that really fundamentally and actually change that. So actually, I'll go back a second. So these problems are where my research into news storytelling started. And when I was commissioned to do that research, I think what they expected or what they hoped was I'd come up with some kind of gamified, non-linear kind of way of consuming news that took everyone an hour to consume, because that's cool, right? That's when we do cool journalism. That wasn't what happened because I started speaking to lots of people. So some journalists, sure, but actually then storytellers of all kinds. So game designers, comedians, puppeteers, theatre directors. And what they all told me was that at the heart of storytelling is narrative. So we are hardwired for stories at an evolutionary and neuroscientific level. If you want to dress it up in kind of innovation language, they are virtual reality simulators for life, right? We teach our children stories to help them kind of navigate the world. Fairy tales are the best example of this, to help them navigate the world, to know how to deal with problems, and to understand how to live a better, more fulfilling life. And isn't that what journalism is about too? So narrative is the first of what I call my 7 building blocks of reflective journalism. So why reflective? So 2 reasons why I call it reflective journalism. The first is that we really need to reflect, as I've said, on what we're doing as journalists, what journalism is for, who it's for, and why we're doing it. The second is that we need to reflect the world into which that journalism is going. And right now, we're not adequately reflecting the diversity of that world. Now, I love this quote from a book by Jonathan Gottschall, The Storytelling Animal, who says, "We are, as a species, addicted to story. Even when the body goes to sleep, the mind stays up all night telling itself stories." And it's true, right? And it's a beautiful quote. But bringing it back to journalism, our dreams aren't written in inverted pyramid style. So why are our news stories? Why are we going against that 3,000 years of evolution to create these stories in a weird, kind of backwards way, when actually what all these storytellers taught me, and my research showed as well, was that we want stories which start at the beginning, end at the end, and the start leads to the end. We do everything entirely backwards in journalism. And actually, all that is it comes from the telegraph, like from the technology. The telegraph was very expensive and was unreliable. So it was rational then to put all the important information at the beginning of the message. Now, communications technology has moved on 5, 10 generations since then, but because we're an industry of habits, formulas, we continue doing that because we don't want to reassess exactly what we're doing. So just quickly running through the other building blocks. Content. The information we provide has to be what citizens, not journalists, need and want. Just to give you a really quick example, James Ball yesterday, when he was talking about budget calculators. So when our finance minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, announces his budget every year, the terribly clever interactive content we provide is always somewhere along the lines of, as a result of this budget, you will be £100 a year better off. Right, I've got news for you guys. That is not journalism, right? That is actually an ideological statement which says a low-tax, small-state economy is good for you per se, because it's defining better off in such a narrow way, just the money in your pocket. But actually, we're complaining about the health service, we're complaining about education. How about if we wanted more money spent on those services? But the way we frame that as journalists makes it seem like putting up taxes is a bad thing in and of itself, right? So the way we're contributing to democratic discourse is framing the debate one way already. And that's, again, just a habit. The other thing is, like, why do we do so much individual crime? Why do we cover so much individual crime? It might be exciting and prurient and a bit spicy, but when we're talking about society, does that help us have a reasoned debate about whether rehabilitation or punishment are good things? Or does it actually lead to a situation where people think the world is much scarier than it actually is, and we end up putting everyone in prison as a result of the way that debate is framed by journalists? Actually, we have to think, do we want more crime or less crime? And the way to get less crime is not to put more people in prison. There's no evidence to show that. So we're framing that debate. That's not politicians, that's journalists who are framing that democratic debate. Context. Now, this is the thing that really screamed out from everything I did. Citizens want context and analysis, not just breaking or at least moving news. So on the day news, I worked at Sky News for 15 years. It hugely prioritizes what's happening on that day. But actually, most people do not watch news every day or every hour or every minute. They don't always understand or know the context in which that story is happening. They don't understand what's come before and what's going to come afterwards. And we need to deprioritize breaking news and move towards prioritizing the full scope of a story and making that accessible to readers and viewers. Agency. So we're all citizens. I'm not thinking of journalists and citizens as separate people. We are all citizens, right? And I should say, I'm talking about citizens here as all of us, people who are engaged in civic society, not citizens in the sense of people who have legal status, because we know that's a very flawed notion of citizenship. So we all have power, agency. We all can affect what's happening around us. In news, vox pops are clearly the worst example of this, but we're suddenly presented as kind of victims of the news. It's just happening to us. We have no part in that. But actually, we do have a part. So how do we encourage people to express their agency, both on the input side of news, but also on the output side? Are there storytelling methods where actually people can express their own agency, their own choices? Tone. So yeah, again, we need to write in a way that's clear, accessible, and not defined by habits of the past. The Reuters Institute's digital news report from 2 years ago looked at tone, and it found that only 16% of people thought news media used the right tone. 16%. That's hardly anyone. On this, when I was doing my research, I sat in a room with 20 young people from ethnic minority backgrounds and watched an episode of the BBC's 6 o'clock news. It was horrifying, but more people need to do it, because within 20 seconds, they were gone. The headlines hadn't even finished, and they had switched off, because it wasn't speaking to them. That's story choice, it's language, it's all these things. Like, we still do TV headlines as if they're newspaper headlines. Why do we do that? We are speaking, but we're using newspaper headlines. Diversity, I could do a whole other hour and a half on diversity. But what I would say is, there's lots of big talk. Oh yeah, we want to be more diverse. There is very little actual action. My experience of this is people say, oh yeah, I really want to hear from different perspectives. And then you'll give them a different perspective. Oh yeah, can you have a different perspective that's a bit more like the perspective we already have? Because that's a bit scary over there. So I'm like, people, because like, you'll all recognize it from your newsrooms, right? And then finally, transparency. So this goes back to that existential problem of trust, right? We need to be much clearer about how and why we're reporting and acknowledge gaps in our knowledge. We can't use anonymous sources in political reporting and then be surprised when people don't trust us, right? The two things are naturally follow from each other. At least if we explain why and how we're doing that, what I call radical transparency, then at least we have a hope. We can't pretend using things like anonymous sources is going to help encourage trust. So all in all, I came up with this construction, which I call orientation, what I believe journalism should be for. So really simply, journalism should help us understand the world, locate us in our environment, and enable us to meaningfully interact with it. It should help us form views which are consistent with the needs and interests of ourselves and our communities. I'm not going to use the B word here, but that's what inspired it, because we had a terrible media debate around that. But that all sounds really obvious when you write it down. But when you look at the journalism which actually exists in the world, how much of it actually fulfills that purpose? Not an awful lot. So it's just, it's my thought of how do we test ourselves against what journalism is actually for. So, the future, what I think the future should be. Citizen-focused journalism, built with community in mind, but also leveraging the power of artificial intelligence, natural language, technology of all kinds. Now, lots of that stuff I've talked about before, I always say it sounds like kind of yoga pants, namaste kind of stuff, right? But actually, I'm really hard-nosed about technology as well. So I'm working with a team here in Bergen on a journalism AI collaboration across Europe, because I think we can do better journalism at scale using AI, as long as we fundamentally reimagine the journalism that's the root. Technology on its own isn't the answer. We need to reimagine the journalism which lies at the root of it. And to help us in doing that, this is a slide on here from Harkin, who some of you may have heard of, who deal in community engagement tools. And their key motivators for engagement are vulnerability or pain. So that's a desire to have an immediate need met. Curiosity, a desire to learn. Connection, a desire to belong. Serving others, which is largely underrated, a desire to help other people than ourselves. And storytelling, a desire to be heard or hear the stories of people with lived experience of an issue. Now, these are fundamental human needs. And again, they give us a checklist in a way. Are we meeting those fundamental, visceral human needs in our journalism? Or are we just creating something that fits into the patterns of journalism? Because this is the way we're going to connect, by connecting with those fundamental human needs. Now, our answer to that at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, so I've gone in slightly in a weird direction. It's not weird, it's amazing, an amazing direction. It's become a vocation rather than a job. So we've launched this just in the last month. And we've done a lot of community engagement activities over the last 3-4 years. And what all those activities have told us is the legacy media have had their chance, and they've blown it over the last 100 years. They've either underrepresented communities, or worse in a way, misrepresented communities. And what all those communities have told us is we want to tell our own stories now. And so what the People's Newsroom Initiative is, some of you may have heard of the Tiny News Collective in the US, but basically the idea is to move away from us as journalists being the gatekeepers to being facilitators, to enable people and communities to tell their own stories. So we're hoping to provide the kind of back office support, the legal support, a design framework, revenue support, to make it possible for communities up and down the UK right now to tell their own stories, because that is how we're going to build trust in journalism again. So going back to the kind of technology side of things, we know AI and NLG can write stories pretty well right now. But what can computers not do? Where do we win? This is from Chelsea Herring at Harkin. Humans still win at the game of intimacy, care, and mutual support. And we will for a very long time to come. And care is at the center of that. People say to me, how do we get people to pay for this piece of journalism or that piece of journalism? And I think, how do we show them care in everything we do? Because care from organizations is such a kind of valuable currency that people leap at it when you show them care. And that, to me, is where the future of journalism is built on. If we want to kind of make it much more kind of concrete, journalism is a service, right? We forget that. Journalism is a service. If you worked at Procter & Gamble or Unilever and people stopped using your products and you just carried on doing the same thing, you wouldn't work at Procter & Gamble or Unilever for very long. But in journalism, that's what we're doing. And that is not going to work. So to get back to sort of the beginning, this is how a colleague of mine made me cry. Because she saw a talk I did like this, and she sent me this because she decorated her notebook. And she said, it reminded me of why I became a journalist and why we do what we do. And really, that's all I'm here for. I think we all need to remember why we became journalists and turn it into a vocation again rather than a job. So just to kind of wrap up, the future of journalism to me is grounded in care and collaboration. And I see it here with everything that Anne and her team are doing. And it's important to remember that this is more important than news organizations, nations, individuals. This is important for society. It's important for all our futures. So I'm really glad to be here, collaborating with you, caring with you, and I'm really excited to be building the future of journalism with you all too. So thank you.
Thank you. Stay with us just a little bit, Shirish. Thank you so much for that great kickoff for today. Now, you will be joining us for a panel in a little bit after we hear from some Norwegian initiatives that might change your kind of bleak view on legacy media. We'll see. But we have time for a few questions from the audience, if anyone wants to ask a question to what Shirish just said. And while you think about that, I'll ask you one. Because based on what you're saying, I can understand how a lot of journalists find this kind of hard to fuse into also the journalistic ethos of discovering what's wrong in society, being investigative, stating truth to power. Do you see there is a dissonance or a difference between what you are proposing here and that sort of traditional view on journalism or not?
No, 100% no, because I truly believe in all those, and I've built my career on doing investigations and holding truth to power. What I should say, and what I should have said when I was going through, is it's very nice to have these big thoughts, but actually I did some hard work as well and built a set of prototypes based on some or all of those principles. And we haven't got time to go through them today, but we tested them with more than 1,200 people. And we found in the most successful of those, we tested them against the original BBC article on which they're based. 75% of people said it helped them understand the story better. and more than 80% of people said the ways of doing journalism we tried, timelines which went forward, simple question and answers, were more engaging than what currently exists right now. And they were getting a third more information in half the time. So actually, we can do whatever investigations we like. The truth is, and I work at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, right? No one is reading your 3,000-word long read, right? Actually, they want information that's consumably provided and actually done in a way that is accessible to them. So yeah, I get the question, but actually, yeah, I'm fully on board with that.
Cool. Any questions from the audience? We have a question down here. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting presentation. I agree with almost everything you said.
Almost.
But one thing worries me. I mean, this has been tried for a couple of decades without actually anybody succeeding. I mean, except for some, I mean, the Zetland in Denmark and the correspondent in Holland. And then you have some experiments in the US, Voice of San Diego, for instance. But others have failed. So, I mean, there's no... What is the business model for this type of journalism and this form of engagement?
Yeah, so on the engagement front, I think there are different business models and it will depend on the community you're working with. So what we're doing with the People's Newsroom is we're not setting out a particular model for business, but what we are saying is you need to spend a long time working with the community, doing the deep audience research to actually figure that out. And yeah, we're working for 10 months before we're actually producing something with this. Because yeah, like it's really easy to have the big thoughts, but unless someone's paying for it, that is not going to work, right? And I think as journalists, we want to do the exciting journalism stuff and forget about the revenue stuff. So yeah, I think it's really important, but I think there's increasingly interesting work happening in that space, of which we can use a diverse range of models depending on the context in which you're working.
Thank you so much, Shirish. You'll have another opportunity to ask questions at the end of the panel, so keep that in mind. Thank you, and we'll get back to you in a second, because right now we'll be challenging or listening to the approach from someone who definitely represents legacy media. With a 150-year history of covering the city we're in right now. So please welcome to the stage the editor-in-chief of Bergens Tidende, Frøy Gudbrandsen, to tell us a little bit about her and the newspaper's approach to what can we do about connecting to the audiences that we don't serve as well as we maybe should. Frøy.
Thank you. And thank you for both inspiring and provocative and challenging start of this morning. I really liked your presentation. Okay, first of all, from my perspective, I think that one of the biggest changes that we have seen in at least our news organization is that we have started the process of making journalism not for journalists but for our readers. And we started that process a few years ago, and we've taken quite big leaps as I see it. And one of the reasons for that, or there are several reasons, but first of all, you know, the whole media business has been in a big crisis in Norway, and that came as a big shock to many of our journalists and for the media industry. And it started the processes of soul searching. We had to think differently than we had done before. And also we have more information about how our readers consume our journalism. And of course we could see that a lot of journalism that we produce, people simply didn't read it. So this is not new to us, that we have to change the way of making journalism, but it's a really long process and it's never ending. That is one of the, I think, the new ways of thinking, that reaching new audiences, reaching more people than we did traditionally, it's just our job to do that continuously. So, but one of the biggest changes that we have seen the last years is that we now think about the readers, our users, and what are their needs. Instead of just thinking what's happening, let's write something about it. But it's not an easy process. It's not an easy job. Okay, so I'll tell a little bit about how we work to try to reach more people than we did traditionally, or other people. First, I want to say that a couple of years ago, we did some analysis about how can we reach younger people. What are their needs? How can we change our journalism to reach them better? And also with women and different types of subgroups of readers. And while there are some differences, one of the biggest findings that we had is that actually people want the same things. They want trustworthy journalism. They want stories told by really good journalists. And in this chaotic news landscape where it's difficult to navigate, you have social media, you have a lot of news providers, people need journalists that can help them navigate. And this is almost universal. So when we want to try to reach more people and different people, the good news is that people want more or less the same thing. And then there's the packaging. We can tell the stories in slightly different ways, but people just want really good journalism. They want trustworthy journalism. So that is the core of what we do. So what has this process led us to when thinking more about what do people need? One thing is that we have changed where we present stories and where we present news. One of the biggest changes that we see both in Bergens Tidende and many other places is podcasts. Younger people very often want to listen to news and want to listen to the stories and to consume them have the stories told in a slightly different way. So we make more podcasts, and through making podcasts, we reach younger audiences that we simply are unable to reach through our traditional news. And I think we just started that journey also. But also, if we think about how did we cover the corona crisis, the COVID, the whole thing. Very often we ask ourselves the questions, what do our readers need now? And when you ask that question, it changes what news you make and how you present it. For example, after these press conferences that came at the same time almost every day, we tried to give people the news. What do they need now? And we saw that through thinking that way, we were able to reach people in a completely different way. And we made, like you said, that new formats and focusing too much about formats is like not the right way to do it. Well, yeah, I think it is, because it can structure it can structure your journalism. It can make you, if you have the right formats to present the news in, it can actually help you reach people better. So in the Bergens Tidende, we have now actually a specific task force, and they are almost all here, new digital formats, who work on how we can change our standard formats that we produce journalism in. Because we see that it makes us it's easier to reach more readers while doing it that way. And also we have made some changes in where we are present in social media. Whereas of course we have a presence on Facebook, but when we want to reach younger and more women than before, Instagram has turned out to be a much more effective place to be visible. Okay, it's a small change, but it's not transforming journalism, but still it's a decision made on where do we reach the new public? Where do we find those people? And we have them all on Facebook, so we need to go somewhere else. And it's also, increasing our presence on Instagram is also based on, and not on Snap or on TikTok, it's based on realism. We are legacy media. We come from a place where we reach adults, basically. And when our ambition to grow and to reach more people, we have to reach the people that we are actually able to reach, and that is adults, basically. And increasing engagement among the people that we have a potential to engage. I think that's the place to start. And then we can always have ambitions to further down the road engage younger people and ethnic minority groups to a large extent. But right now, like, the biggest group is actually that's my opinion, we have to start with engaging the group that is closest to us, and then we can slowly, in this really long journey that we're on, try to increase our presence other places. Yes. But I want to comment a couple of comments to your presentations in the end. First, I really wish you spoke Norwegian or could read Norwegian, because there are so much interesting things happening in Norway now, and I think our journalism on taxes, for instance, I think it's a little bit different here than in. I think there are some variations there. But also, I completely agree that stories has to be told, and journalism is about storytelling. But it's not only that. It's very often people do not want to hear a story. They want to hear, tunnel is closed, find another way to drive, These are the restrictions that you have to follow now. So our balance is to, and that is based on thinking about, that knowledge is based on our data showing that what do people need right now, and very often that is very effective news reporting on what are the most important things right now. So yes, we have to find new ways of telling stories and different stories, and definitely more diverse perspectives and more diverse newsrooms. But I think if you really take seriously what our readers need right now, it gives you a variety of answers. I think the time is up.
Thank you so much. A big round of applause for that. No slides, no notes presentation. Thank you so much. I'm very impressed by that. And I look forward to having you in the panel with Shirish in a little bit, because this looks to be a very interesting discussion on journalism. Thank you. More applause. And before we get into the panel, we want to showcase one project in particular. And like Frøy said, I do wish you spoke Norwegian for Shirish, because there is some interesting things going on. And we are going to hear from a very specific project in that it approached both an underserved audience, a youth group or a school class, and also an underserved storytelling format. I'm not going to stand here and explain it. Please welcome to the stage our friends from Fædrelandsvennen and the class 10C, was it? 9C. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. I would like to talk to you about this story. It's a story about 14, 15-year-old kids, a target audience that is really hard for us to reach, and so it all started with two journalists who were tired that we were writing about the youth, but not for the youth and with the youth. So it's all started there. The purpose behind this was it should be about the youth, and with the youth and about the youth. So the journalist started sending out surveys to the students about what their interests were, what did they spend time doing, how much time did they use social media, what did they want to read about. So we wanted to hear from them what they wanted us to write about. And then the journalists moved into the classroom of one specific school class for a week. being at school on their premises. They were taking math tests, having gymnastics, being in the classroom all the week to gain that trust and to tell their story. So they also used Snapchat while they were at the school, communicating with the students and other junior high schools in Kristiansand, asking them questions to get the knowledge about what is the best story to tell here. What do they want to read from us? And after we had collected all this information and been at this school for a week, then the work began, like writing out these stories. And also, Fædrelandsvennens audience is like many other Norwegian newspapers, around 50-year-old people. The article format is something that's quite boring, straight out of the box. So we took a look at what the youth said they like to where they like to read their stories and how they spent their time, and then the answer was Snapchat and Instagram. Snapchat at most. So then we decided that okay, we were going to target the 14-year-olds. They are telling us that Snapchat is the place they like to be on their mobile phone. Well, we have to make something that's looks like Snapchat or is in that area, you know. As you can see, big pictures, not too much text, easy stories, because I don't know if you have kids or been sitting on the bus looking at those people just scrolling on the phone. It's all happening so fast. There's not much time to get their attention and get them to really read something. So we utilized big pictures, movies, some quizzes, interactive quizzes you can take in the article, quotes, and yeah, try just to make it like a social media platform. Also, we were promoting the stories on Snapchat, Instagram, to some degree Facebook, trying to target this age group. It's really hard work, and I won't stand here saying that we solved it, we fixed it, we have this all done, because we don't. It's really tough, but we could see a significantly drop in age from who was reading these articles. So I guess we did some good. We managed to do some of the things we were trying to do. Here you can see the math quiz. The journalist had to take them for themselves. I have to say one of the journalists is my wife. So I was sitting beside her the evening before, and she was like, "I can't do this. I don't know anything. I just like." But then I guess it was much easier for her to interview the other students after the test, because she was feeling a little bit of the same feelings of anxiety and everything they were going through. So and here is all this. We had afterwards, because we were collaborating with them to tell a story. We had a last chapter which was thank you and the presentation of each students in that class, and a send off from the teachers. So we really tried to be one of them, write for them, with them, as I guess some of what Shirish is speaking about. And here you can see the quiz you can try. Yeah. What did we learn from this? I guess we learned that we can write really good stories, even though we are collaborating with people who are telling us what they want to read about. But it's interesting not just for those people, but also for the parents and everybody else to know what does my child think about, want to read about. Also, it's really hard to get that age number down to below 40, but we had a spike. Of course, we had to have this opened as an open article, but not behind the paywall. It has, because here we were saying we want the 14-year-olds to read it, so we should not, we cannot make them pay for it. This was free. And also Snapchat, as a journalist tool is great if you want to reach some new groups that you're not talking to already, for comment stories and stuff like that. Because when the journalists asked them questions on Snapchat or group chats on Snapchat, the response was really quick, and they had a great dialogue the week they were at the school. Because I have to say, the week they were staying at the school, they did not write any stories. We didn't publish anything at the page or in the newspaper. All of the thing that was published was on Instagram and Snapchat primarily, and some Facebook. Where just like today, we're in class 9C and we are having gymnastics, and we made a video of the journalist trying to roll over and silly stuff. But we were using also Snapchat to communicate with the students what's on the agenda for tomorrow, who would like to be in front of camera, who would like to be in the background, who is comfortable speaking with us about this, and is there anybody who have a special story that we should tell? And that kind of dialogue. And we couldn't have that on mobile phone. We could have it on a text message, of course, but they're so into this Snapchat environment. This is where they live. We also have a video of their screen time, and you can see that they're spending like 4 hours a day at Snapchat, 7 hours in total or more on their mobile phone. They were telling us about when they went to bed, they would spend a couple of more hours on the phone before they went to sleep. So so this is how we made a wholeheartedly effort in writing for and about the youth, I guess. Thank you.
I should say I'm absolutely in love with this story. I'm so much in love with it. I actually forgot to introduce you by name. So Ommundsen from Fædrelandsvennen, everyone, and thank you. I want to ask you a couple of questions while we set up for the panel behind us. And my biggest question this is a wonderful project, and I love the empathy that went into it from the journalist side. Has it changed anything about how you approach your other journalism?
It has changed something, especially for the two journalists who was in the classroom and experienced this firsthand, about how to reach out to people using social media, how to keep those channels open, I guess, and also how to. It was really difficult for them how to write these small texts on these cards and not overcomplicated in writing a lot. So I guess I can see both of those journalists are working really hard with keeping it shorter, more to the point when they are targeting. Their job now is to target under 40, so they have a little bit not 14-year-olds. We can't go there that we are going to just go for the 14-year-olds, but they're really conscious about how they write and how long and stuff like that. I would like to say that we kept these channels open at Snapchat, and we remember to just keep growing everything and stuff like that, but we didn't. That's our biggest mistake, is that Snapchat group we had with the students, and that we allowed that to die out after we were finished with the project. I guess many of you can relate to that feeling. You finished a big project and you forget a little bit to follow it up. And also the article format we have with the downward scroll and the vertical and the chapters and stuff is now soon available for all the journalists in the house to use whenever they want, directly to the CMS. So that's a good thing. We have that format locked down now. So I guess some good things come out of this.
And how did the rest of the newsroom that were not directly involved with the project approach this?
They were really supportive and cheering about it, I guess, and laughing. It was a lot of laughing about the journalist having gymnastics and trying to be at school. But some didn't like this form of reading at all. They were really skeptical, scroll down to read the chapter, to scroll to vertical for a new chapter. I guess one editor just said, I don't understand it. We have to have some sort of disclaimer in front. You have to use it like this. But we had a classroom as a test group, focus group. So they tested it, and they was like, of course, we know how to use this.
So how did you counter that story?
No, we just have to say that this is not for you. This is for the 14-year-olds. So they understand it. That's our mission, was to make something they understand and liked, and we have managed to do that. But I have to tell, even though we put hours and hours into this presentation, the most joy we got out of them was showing them the print paper with
the kids.
With the kids, when they could see themselves in the traditional paper. That was top notch. But
So, who said legacy media is dead, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that inspiration, Mats Ommundsen, Federlandsen.
Thank you,
Round
guys.
of applause. And now, if Shirish and Frøy would join me back up on the stage, and we'll also be joined by Astrid Gunhild, who's a professor of media studies here and heads the journalistic research group here at the University of Bergen. So we'll discuss a little bit what we just heard. However you like. So polite. And I want to start with you, Astrid, because you have not been on the stage yet. From your perspective, how do you feel about both what Shirish has sort of challenged us to think differently and what you heard from the Norwegian projects and from Frøy?
I think it was very interesting what you told us, and my first thinking was that you are working exactly at the core of journalism. And what I felt very strongly from you during the presentation was that you have a vision and you have a mission and you know why you're a journalist. And when I heard Frøy speaking too, that was the same thing. She's also talking about how could you do this as interesting as possible, not only for the audience, but also for the journalists. So I would say that journalism is not only for the audience. I think that journalists are just as important.
Really interesting. And Shirish, now you've heard a little bit from some Norwegian newsrooms. And what are your thoughts on the projects you've seen or the thoughts you've heard from Frøy?
Yeah, so I would say I completely agree with you. Well, I don't think we disagree, actually. I don't think formats are, I think we do need to change formats. I think what we've done too often is focus solely on format without reimagining the underlying journalism. And as to Mats' presentation, I was absolutely blown away because for me, that deep engagement in a situation with his wife doing the quizzes, that's actually what I'm talking about. And again, people will recognize this from their newsrooms. People will say in meetings, what we want to do is we want to spend some time with communities, build trust, reinvigorate our relationship with our audiences. Can we do that tomorrow? Right? And actually, you can't do it tomorrow. You actually need to spend the time. Trust doesn't happen overnight. You need to show up day after day, frankly, and be there for your community, for your audience, and show that care. And I think that's a really great example. Mats' presentation was a really great example of how that works. And that empathy of actually doing the test, which some people may say goes away from that notion of objectivity, is actually where you get the connection and where people start to trust you because they know you're going through the same thing. So yeah, I think both. I'm absolutely kind of fascinated by and blown away by.
And Frøy, I was fascinated by what you said because one of the things that I've heard, I've been to a lot of these conferences, I've been to a lot of discussions about how other kinds of methodology, other kinds of empathy might help journalism connect with other audiences. And what it often comes down to is leadership and leadership in the newsroom. And well, you happen to be a leader in the newsroom, actually a top executive in the newsroom. How much would you say that the approach, initiatives or ideas come bottom up or top down or somewhere in between in your newsroom?
What type of initiatives?
The initiatives that say, oh, we should do this podcast to reach these audiences, or we need to do something differently. Where does that idea of changing originate?
Well, I think most ideas come bottom up, definitely. Bottom up, and that is the way it should be. But then there is, I think, definitely most ideas come bottom up. I have some ideas sometimes, and
you sold yourself a little bit short earlier because you actually launched a podcast yourself yesterday.
I did, yeah.
On climate change?
On climate, yes.
Yeah.
Before the Glasgow COP meeting, yeah. But then there is, I think, my job as a leader and together with my team of leaders is direction. Because you have all these ideas that are and projects going on, but then we have to try to choose a direction so that it's not going in, just becomes too chaotic. And also I think one perhaps boring question that, but it's really important, it's organization. How do you organize a newsroom to be able to do this, to enable change on the way?
And how do you do it?
Well, we have. I can show you the organizational map. No, but we actually a year ago we did have a reorg, and some of the changes, or many of the changes that we made, were actually made to be able to change journalism. With that aim. So I think there is that dialogue between our journalists that are really closer to our users and the projects they have, and the direction that we set out and how we organize our newsroom. I think that's everything goes together.
Yeah.
You need all of it.
I think you probably do. From your perspective, sort of studying the media industry from outside, but knowing it very well, Astrid, do you see the media industry actually changing? What's different now than, say, 20 years ago in how we approach connecting with our audiences?
That's really interesting. I remember when I was a teenager and I got my first summer job in a local newspaper. Do you know what the editor asked me to do? He said, "You have to go out and get the female sources because you're the woman in this newsroom. We have too few sources." And then he said, "Also, you have to come up with some really good news on young people because we don't write enough about young people."
So this sounds like nothing has changed at all, right?
Well, I do think that never ever in history has there been so many formats, so many ways of telling stories, so many voices that come up, so much technology to help, so many ideas that are realized. So I would say that this is the most exciting time ever to do journalism. So I'm not as pessimistic in a way as you are, but I also think that the situation is a bit different in Norway, since UK is a really, really huge country, or at least you have a huge population, lots of local communities, very much more diversity than we do have in Norway. Whereas in this country we have all these local newspapers and some other kinds of traditions. But I think it's just fascinating to see what happens everywhere when it comes to new ways of telling stories. And that goes for this Future Week here. We've learned so much more. But we also know that we have the startups, we have innovation within the newsrooms, we have individuals, we have within research. It's all going on. So it's all about diversity and multiplicity and coming up with the good stuff.
Mm-hmm. I would say that I'm not pessimistic, actually. And actually, when we were having a conversation yesterday, Ingeborg described my presentation as somewhat bleak. And I think it's the opposite, actually. That actually the fact that we're at this existential crisis gives us a real opportunity for really radical change. And so I'm really hopeful about the radical change we can make at this point. So I'm excited. I'm not pessimistic.
I'm really glad. And I was teasing you a little bit about that. But it makes for a really interesting panel, though. And I want to get into what you said earlier about how breaking news should be defocused in the newsrooms. But what you said earlier, Frøy, kind of speaks against that, because you know sometimes what's happening right now is exactly what you need. So when you said less breaking news, what did you actually mean?
Oh, sure. And I agree with that. I think there are immediate needs which we talked about, in the kind of fundamental needs to have a problem solved. But I think a really good example, and I know you're addressing this, is climate change, for example, because again, this is the way newsrooms work, right? That there always has to be a peg for a story. Why are we doing this today? Now, the problem is we are really bad at dealing with long-term systemic change, which happens gradually over time. Like the Earth isn't putting out a press release saying, come to our news conference in a week's time, so then you can do the story on that day. And when we need a peg for every story, when our editor is saying, why are we doing this today? Somehow we're all going to die in a ball of flame isn't enough, right? And it should be. So actually dealing with that gradual change over time and not just dealing with, actually, this thing is happening today, so we're going to cover it. I think we do need to sort of switch our focus a little bit on that to deal better with systemic change. And the things, health inequality, things like that are really big concerns. And also in terms of the way newsrooms are organised, why do we have an environment correspondent who's separate from the health correspondent or the economics correspondent, right? Those are the same thing. They're not separate. But actually, again, in newsroom politics, if one of those correspondents treads a tiny bit into the beat of another correspondent, you have an enormous row. But actually, health inequality, economics, climate, they're all fundamentally intertwined. And our organisations don't have the structures to deal with that right now.
Right, I know you think a lot about these things.
Yes, I do think a lot about these things. And I think if you have the solutions on how we can engage readers and reading about long-term processes, I'm really interested. But because I think that's difficult. Yeah. And it's one of the, how do we cover the long-term effect? How does the climate changes and both the climate changes itself, but also the radical changes in the labor market that it will give to this region of Norway? How do we actually cover that in a good way? It's challenging, but I don't think I agree with you that we have to switch focus, because what we need is to engage our readers, and we need to make sure that our readers continue to come to our websites and that they are every day come to our newspapers to get updated. And the need that people have every day is to get updated. So I think we need to Bergens Tidende, I believe we should be a news destination that give you what you need to know right now, on your way to work, on the way home from work, before you go to bed and all that. But then in addition, we need to find better ways of covering long-term processes and complicated societal issues. But I think I think actually we need to strengthen ourselves when it comes to the more breaking news, because I think it's important. But so it's we need both.
I want to ask you a little bit about methodology, and maybe particularly Shirish, because I've been in this business for longer than I care to admit, but it's been at least 20 years since I was in journalism school. And I do remember us learning a lot about how to do research, how to use the Norwegian laws to ask for Freedom of Information Act requests. How do you kind of fulfill that journalistic ethos of speaking truth to power, which is what a lot of journalism is about. We'll also learn a bit about storytelling. This is how you write a good article, or this is how you produce a TV segment, that kind of thing. But in recent years, I find that a lot of journalism conferences, for instance, tend to focus about the same kinds of things. These are the good stories. This is how we told them. And then I go to tech conferences and we talk about completely different methodologies. This is how you empathize. This is how you do design thinking. This is how you approach different audiences that you don't connect with. This is how you study, like you said earlier, this is how you can learn from art or from the games industry. And somehow I have a hard time getting journalists and tech and innovation people to kind of meet up in these kind of areas and discuss where are the methodologies or kind of moves that we might learn from each other. Astrid, what's your take on that?
Well, I think it's interesting if we go back to the story that Mats was telling us about. Notice that how they did it. They used what we in research call participant observation. And I think that was such a good example of what you can do and what you can learn if you innovate by applying something from one field into another field. And I think that's one of the really big solutions for you to engage with audiences and these really big questions about systemic and long-term change as well.
And what do you find when you recruit young journalists, younger than me, into Bergens Tidende? What are today's young journalists' methodology, or what do they have in their backpack in terms of how do we do journalism? How do we think about journalism? What is journalism, in your opinion? And what might we challenge the universities and others to think differently about in education?
Oh, it would be better if you asked if we had like a 23-year-old newly recruited
well, now
journalist
I'm asking
here.
the leadership here.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I think one of the big changes is the, at least that I see in some journalists, young journalists, is the visual way of thinking. And I see that I have a 14-year-old son, and he doesn't read. He just he just watches videos. You know, that's the way he. And when he communicates with me, he also sends videos. So it's like, but and that we can see also in younger journalists that they have a different way of thinking about that. But at the same time, I think the reasons why you become a journalist, they are the same, and to be honest, it's quite similar. I think the motivation and that you have a mission, you want to contribute somehow.
Mm-hmm. What I've heard a lot of times from people in newsrooms is that, oh, that's all nice and dandy, and we could do this kind of change for this project, but now let's get on with the everyday stuff because we have a lot of things going on.
That is a really good point, because like the Feven project we just saw, I love it. We have done some really nice projects in Bergens Tidende also that are so inspiring and so important. But how do we make it? How do we make that our daily journalism? That is the big. That
do you have the
challenge
for us?
Well, so like people often ask me, and it's a shame we haven't got to have time to go through the prototypes and the testing I did. But people often say to me like, yeah, how do we get the managers of newsrooms to change? We want to change things. How do we get people to change? And I say, well, look, I show them the evidence, and we had, like I say, had 75% of people saying it helped them understand the story better, 83% of people saying it engaged them better, and they were getting more information, a third more information in half the time. Now, the way we did quite simple changes to format to do that, and actually most newsrooms could implement that tomorrow, like zero cost. It's actually quicker to write than a standard story. But if people don't want to change, then they won't change. They will go and fly in the face of the evidence. It's the Procter & Gamble Unilever situation. So I like, again, I don't want to be all yoga pants, namaste. I want to have the data to show this, and we do have the data to show this. And so actually, it's about thinking, yeah, actually, we need to make a change. I get it's difficult to make a kind of radical change overnight. But actually what we're seeing with what you're doing and what Matt's doing is there's a gradual change, and actually it will normalise that change and doing things differently. But I think there do need to be some bigger fundamental changes, but actually so that research and data is how we do that, by showing this is fundamentally much better at doing what we want journalism to be and reaching more people.
We're gonna, if we have a microphone around, we're gonna open for some questions from the audience as well. So you guys can start thinking about that. But Shirish, you said in your presentation also that some audiences that you've connected with feel that, oh, legacy media has failed us, let's tell our own stories. What are the challenges that legacy media organizations will meet from other kinds of storytellers and other kinds of journalism that we haven't seen yet, that Frøy should prepare for?
Well, I think, I say, it goes back to that fundamental problem of trust, that actually those communities, those people, don't trust legacy media because, as I say, they've been either underrepresented or misrepresented. The thing which kind of started me down the process of leaving a major UK broadcaster was, you might remember in the late 2000s, when we were kind of in war on terror country, every day 3 or 4 young Muslim men would be arrested. Now, they would also be released 24 hours later with no charge because it's a big kind of PR thing. And I would say you either have to report the release or you don't report the arrest. We can't have it both ways, because actually it was making the country a dangerous place for Muslim people to live. And actually people would say, well, that's not how our news values work, right? So that's how those communities have been misrepresented and the world has been made a dangerous place for them. And that's happened time after time after time. So actually, it's just a simple question of trust. People will trust stories told from their own community more than they will trust stories told by other people parachuting in. And that's just a fact, right? So that's a challenge, and why that embedding in places and kind of showing up day after day is really important. But also, I think because they're working outside regular newsrooms, actually I think there could be really creative forms of storytelling. I see it in community magazines and newspapers I work with already, that there's much more kind of innovative storytelling, because you're not working within a context which already exists. You're not changing iteratively, you're starting something fresh, which is much easier to do something creative. So those are, hopefully there'll be some cross-fertilization. That would be the ideal.
Yeah. Astrid?
Yeah, I agree with you, and I also think that when you're talking about trust, I think we could think about trust within the newsrooms, and that goes to, for instance, leaders trusting the reporters, the journalists, trusting that they are doing a good job. They would want to do perhaps more creative stuff than they are allowed to do. And I think that just working with journalists' inner motivation for their job, just like you've been doing with yourself, that would promote really good results.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Anyone want to ask something or comment on something?
Can I just comment small comment that I forgot about journalism being like journalists write for other journalists? I think that is not our biggest challenge now, but I think there still is a challenge that we sometimes tend to write for our sources and more than for citizens, and that is, it's not better to impress our sources than impress other journalists.
And I'm keep kind of looking for hands in the audience, but I'm going to ask you, Frøy, because those of you who know me know I'm deeply, deeply in love with the data for journalism, and also measuring what happens in the newsroom. But what is it we miss when we sort of focus on measuring the effect of journalism, measuring the audience, measuring what engages, which I think is important and that we should absolutely do? What are the potential blind spots that creates in a newsroom?
Well, it's like like the reason why we are here. We are here as to empower people. We are here to challenge power. We are here to investigate when there is power abuse. Our data don't tell us to do more of that. So I think the basis for our journalism has to be something we decide. And then I think data tells us, me as a leader in Bergens Tidende and journalist, we have to decide what stories are the important stories to tell. Also, and we have to communicate with readers, and do we meet your needs? And the data can tell us, did we tell this story in the right way? But did we challenge power enough? Data will never tell us that. So we need to. That is the big blind spot, I think, that we can. If we are too focused on data.
We had a question from the audience.
Yes, just one short comment or maybe even a question. I'm talking about trust. I mean, the Nordic state countries are really different from the UK and USA, where you have sort of lack of trust is a general problem. So, I mean, comparing, for instance, Norway and UK isn't doing very much to the analysis. But what I was thinking about is is the post-Trump existential crisis in journalism. Sort of with Donald Trump, we were all sort of, everything was clear, and we were on the right side in a white emblem, black world. But now with post-Trump away, we're not quite sure about what to do with this, and neither is, I think, the audience. I mean, it's something happened when Trump disappeared from the stage.
Anyone want to comment on that?
I mean, I have one thought, which is perhaps linked, perhaps separate. But one of the things I found was, so actually one of the things that came up in the Reuters news report, which I quoted, was that when we talk about misinformation and, fake news or whatever, people aren't worried about content farms in Russia. The thing they state is the biggest source of misinformation is domestic politicians, right? But habitually as journalists, we will go to politicians for quotes for every story, right? And that we don't need to do that, right? Because actually we know that they're coming from an ideological perspective. They're saying what it suits them to say, rarely based on truth, because they know what they're doing, we know what they're doing. But is going to politicians for quotes, whether you're covering all spectrums or not, helping people understand the fundamentals of a story? And I would argue very often it's not. So we kind of need to get out of that habit of thinking, well, we must go to every political party to get a quote on this. Because does it fundamentally help people understand the story? Actually, if we stick to the facts, that is going to be more helpful in that orientation perspective that I talked about earlier.
And I think we're going to keep that as the closing comment for this session. The idea that what value does this journalism actually bring to the people meant to use it might be something we'll keep discussing over weeks, years, months to come. Thank you so much, Frøy and Astrid. You both read Norwegian, so you get a book. Thank you so much. And Shirish, seeing as you don't read Norwegian, this is a AI brewed beer made right here at the Media City Bergen complex. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you all to the audience, and thank you to the people at home.